Peter. We knew Peter would have contacted us.
The shadowy worlds of witchcraft and evil converge in New Orleans.
Somewhere along the line, witchcraft and Satanism got married together.
I told her that I needed to speak with her about the disappearance of Peter Weber.
A mystery that leads investigators into Louisiana swampland.
We came back here one day and it was just death.
Was it rage or ritual?
I remember standing there and thinking to myself, this is not happening. I know this is not happening.
Why the blood running warm in your vein, your vein?
In 1996, 27-year-old Peter Weber left his family and moved to Louisiana.
Peter was born in 1969. Peter was the baby of the family, and I was the oldest. There's 5 children in the family, and we're all very close.
Peter had been working at a resort town on the Jersey Shore before arriving in the Big Easy.
Peter and a group of friends had decided that they were going to go down there and make some money waitering in New Orleans.
New Orleans is a tourist town. It draws a certain segment of people we've had people who would actually come down from Mardi Gras, and 2 weeks later, they'd still be wandering the streets. People tend to use the term lose their mind when they come down here.
Once Peter got to New Orleans, he didn't have a place to stay, so he basically started out staying at hostels for a few weeks.
My boyfriend Jesse and I were going down Decatur Street, and he saw someone he knew, and he introduced me to his friend Peter. And then we found out Peter was living in one of those little boarding house things, and I had a whole back area of my house that didn't have anybody living in it. So instead, Peter moved in with us.
Jesse Lee and Peter had worked together in a restaurant in New Jersey 2 years earlier. Jesse Lee and his girlfriend, Isla Womack, were Wiccans, believers in a pagan religion and practitioners of witchcraft.
I made sure that he knew that I was Wiccan before he moved in, because I know some people are uncomfortable with that, and I didn't want him to be uncomfortable.
Soon, Peter landed a job waiting tables at a nearby cafe. And when he wasn't working, he was hanging out with Jesse, drinking.
Jesse drank all the time. If I didn't see him with beer in his hand, he was not in a good mood. When Peter drank, he was obnoxious. But when he wasn't drunk, he was a very nice man.
Since he'd arrived in New Orleans in October, Peter checked in with his family every week. But shortly after Christmas, the calls stopped. 3 weeks passed with no word from Peter.
This was unlike Peter not to have called home, let us know where he was going.
Helen Spence was worried. She called anyone she could who might know where Peter was, but with no luck.
He had not reported to work, and he didn't pick up his paycheck. I spoke with Isla, asked her if she knew where Peter was. She said that Peter was doing drugs, and she just couldn't have Peter doing drugs around her son in her house. I did know that Peter was drinking a lot, but I know Peter did not have a drug problem.
Helen didn't know where else to turn. Feeling helpless, she called the New Orleans Police Department.
When my lieutenant first handed me this case, he's like, call this lady, she can't find her brother. And I remember his famous words were, it's probably nothing. Because honestly, 95% or greater of missing person cases are nothing.
Helen provided Detective Anderson with the only solid information she had, Peter's last known address, 1636 North Lopez Street.
So myself and Detective Terry Phillips went over to that house. And when we arrived, we knocked on the door and no one answered. So I then realized that the door was actually ajar about an inch. And I looked in and saw someone sitting there watching television. So I pushed open the door and I said, hello, and I introduced myself, you know, police, can I talk to you?
The man sitting in the chair was Peter's roommate, Jesse Lee.
When we asked Jesse about Peter, he indicated that Peter was an alcoholic and he decided to seek treatment and that he was in a rehab facility. There were certain little cues that just didn't appear to be right. His nervous actions, his looking away.
Detective Anderson glanced around the dark room and saw a small boy. He asked if anyone else lived there.
He said the owner of the house is Isla. This is her son, and so you need to go talk to her. And that's when he gave us the address, location of the witch's closet.
Anderson made his way through the narrow streets of the French Quarter to find Isla. Soon, he was immersed in the shadowy world of the occult.
It's a little smaller place, and on the walls were just jars and jars of herbs and crow's feet and all these different things that I guess people put in witch's brew. She wore very pale makeup and very dark eyeliner, long, straight hair, real pale skin. When we interviewed Isla, we stepped to a rear area, a little courtyard area inside the witch's closet. And at that point, I asked her questions as to when's the last time she saw Peter Weber. Did Peter say where he was going?
I told him that as far as I knew that Peter had gone to a drug treatment center, that other than that I did not know.
Jesse and Isla hadn't given Anderson much to go on. He reported all he knew to the family and then started making phone calls.
I did contact the jails to see if they had any persons locked up, the hospitals, if they had any people who may have sustained brain or head trauma that just may not remember who they are.
At the same time, a panicked Helen called rehab facilities all over Louisiana.
This was a 24-hour day, 7 days a week, trying to find Peter. Once we had exhausted calling all the area rehab centers, and we kind of felt that, you know what, Peter's not in a rehab.
I think at one point she was very frustrated with me because of the answers that we were given. I knew something was amiss. We just could not put our hand on what it was.
The family was desperate for answers. In March, Peter's brother Robert flew to New Orleans to do whatever he could to help with the investigation.
He spoke with Detective Kevin Anderson. He put up flyers that we had made, and he went out to the Lopez Street address and spoke with Isla.
But Robert Weber learned nothing new.
I told Robert that Peter had gone in for drug treatment and that he had gone, I didn't know where.
This was tearing my family up. We wanted to know that he was safe.
It had been 2 months since anyone had heard from Peter Weber. Detective Anderson knew that time was running out. It had been 8 weeks since Peter Weber disappeared without a trace from his home in New Orleans. Dead end after dead end left Detective Kevin Anderson with little hope.
I believe in being honest with people. We had talked about all scenarios. I had asked Miss Spence if Peter had any dental records.
At the time we were sending the dental records down, my mother remembers me saying, "Mom, you might just have to face the fact that Peter's dead." And how her heart just sunk.
I knew if I kept the case file with me, if I carried it all the time, I carried his dental records, it stayed very personal. I just didn't want this to be a case that would fall through the cracks.
Without a body, there was no proof of a crime, and without a crime, Detective Anderson's hands were tied. The only leads he had were Jesse Lee and Isla Womack.
I had come to New Orleans and I began working as a dancer. It's something that I had done years before. It was something I knew I could do to make money.
Jesse Lee was a bouncer at the same club. He moved in with Isla. But the income of a stripper and a bouncer wasn't enough. Before long, the house on North Lopez Street had no phone, no electricity, no running water. And with Isla's young son in the house, it was becoming a crisis.
It wasn't very good there. It was horrible. I used to scavenge the fridge because I was always hungry. It wasn't really nice there. I did not go to school, and I had no friends.
The utilities had been off for 4 weeks when Peter Weber moved in. It looked like this new roommate might help the situation.
He moved in while the electricity was still off, and I had just gotten the water turned on. He said, wait a minute, he says, instead of you trying to raise the money, I'll just have it turned on in my name. It seemed like a good idea. I don't think it was.
4 months had passed since anybody had heard from Peter Weber. Detective Anderson tried to be positive when he spoke with Peter's family, but privately he was frustrated.
You know, people need closure, and the hardest thing was not knowing where, not knowing if he was dead or alive.
Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes
The quiet community of St. Bernard Parish lies an hour outside the frenzy of the New Orleans French Quarter.
It's basically the end of the world. It's a small, family-oriented parish. A lot of people who are born there stay there. It's basically a fishing community. There's a lot of bayous, swampy area. I believe it was somewhere after 2 o'clock in the afternoon when I got a phone call from my supervisor, Captain Marcel David, who told me that a body had been found in a wooded area by 3 adolescent boys.
what you gonna do when the day goes by, honey? Don't know what you gonna do when the day goes by, hey.
The body would have had to been right around here. The feet would have been right around here, and the head would have been somewhere out here. And he was still wearing shoes.
The body was found tightly wrapped in a fitted sheet, which was tied with clothesline all the way around very neatly. And there's a piece of green carpet draped over the victim.
When they took the green carpet off, it still had like a wrapping underneath. It was kind of like plastic bags.
His hands were positioned in a way that a body would be positioned in a coffin. Whoever had done this spent a lot of time positioning the body the way they did. There was no identification at all on the body, and as we continued to unwrap, we found several dimes in the wrappings. I knew that the dimes had to mean something.
When the police lifted up the carpet, they discovered an important clue. The grass underneath was still alive. This meant the body could only have been there for a few days.
There was dirt on the sheet, gave the impression that he had been moved from the dirt somewhere.
It's just really weird to think that back here, we came back here and played every day of our lives when we were little kids, and we came back here one day and it was just death.
Oh, death is awful. Oh, death is awful. Oh,
The autopsy revealed he had been strangled, but there was more. According to the coroner, the victim had suffered severe bruising and possible lacerations consistent with stab wounds.
make death cut me down so soon.
He also determined that although the body had only been in the woods for a few days, the victim had been dead for several months. But Detective Holland still needed to figure out a way to identify the body.
The Times-Picayune does what they call the Metro Briefs, and they run a little paragraph from surrounding parishes. And they did put this victim that we had, saying that there was an unidentified body found in St. Bernard Parish.
20 miles away, Detective Anderson sat down to read his morning paper.
So I'm reading the paper, and it says an unidentified male was found in a wooded area. So I contacted the coroner's office, and I said, I have these dental records. I don't know if it's him. And when he called me back, about 3 hours later, he had an excitement in his voice. And he goes, "You're not going to believe it, dental records match."
Detective Anderson's missing persons case was now Detective Holland's homicide.
Everything that I had put into this case was now starting to, I mean, it was kind of like we were at halftime, and now the second half was starting.
The coroner called the Weber family to give them the horrible news.
We had always hoped that Peter would come home alive. Knowing that he was dead and wasn't going to come home was extremely sad for us. The St. Bernard Parish Detectives Department said, we're going to find who killed Peter.
Four months after Peter Weber had gone missing, his body was found in the Louisiana woods, 20 miles outside of New Orleans. The case was assigned to Detective Gina Holland of St. Bernard Parish. But New Orleans Detective Kevin Anderson stayed involved.
I explained to Gina what I had done up to this point. Obviously, the two names that were very central to the missing person investigation were Jesse Lee and Isla Womack.
At the end of our telephone conversation, Detective Anderson says, "By the way, Isla's a witch."
And Gina said, "What do you mean? She's not nice?"
Oh, like she's mean? I had no idea what he was talking about.
I said, "No, she's a witch, like a practicing witch."
Neither detective had ever encountered anything like this.
I tried to learn a little bit about the Wiccan religion, find out where these people were coming from so I could understand them a little bit better.
Most of the homicides that I've handled were typical drug-related, gang-related murders. This just was a whole nother level of understanding.
Mimi Lansu is a practicing witch in New Orleans. She was trained by the Religious Order of Witchcraft, the same group that trained Isla Womack.
The religious order is designed to honor and celebrate the old religion of witchcraft, to study the arts and science of ritual magic. I exercise myself to be free of all negative vibrations, evil influence. The training that Isla received from the Religious Order of Witchcraft was good training. Controlled, abounding love.
Isla joined the order shortly after she began working at the Witch's Closet.
To me, it seemed like I had found other people who believed the same way that I did, where no one was going to condemn anybody else.
When mainstream America hears the word witch, they always think that, you know, the decrepit crone with the green face and the wart on her nose. You know, or they think about people doing horrendous acts like chopping off heads and kicking them around in a circle, crazy things like that. We fly around on brooms and have sex with the devil.
Most Wiccans believe in spell work. And all that is basically you light a candle, you pray, you chant out loud, which is to be heard by the spirits that are around you.
Yeah, somewhere along the line, witchcraft and Satanism got married together. You know, the gods of the old religion are always the devil of the new.
Holland and Anderson were looking for a link between the witches and Peter Weber's murder. Anderson had already spoken to Isla and gotten nowhere. Now it was up to Holland.
Some people came in who I did not know, and they said they were the detectives from St. Bernard Parish. I should have known not to go to work. I had 2 mismatched shoes on when I got there.
I told her that I needed to speak with her about the disappearance of Peter Weber. Her initial reaction to the murder was, I felt she was trying to act surprised, but I thought it was fake. I advised her that she was a suspect in this matter. I advised her of her rights and asked if she was willing to give a statement Usually when someone gives a formal statement, the detective will type what the person says. But with Isla, she had this big, long, dramatic story that she wanted to tell. And she would make sure that every single word that she said was in that statement.
Isla told Holland that Peter had rented a room in her house at North Lopez Street last fall. She described the 2 months that Peter had lived there with her son Thane, and her boyfriend Jesse. And finally, Isla described the last night she saw Peter alive.
We went to the corner bar. We started to have a talk. Peter decided he wanted more to drink. Jesse decided he wanted more to drink. The next time Peter got up, he bumped into someone in the bar and proceeded to get in a fight in the bar. He was drunk.
Isla claimed they dragged the belligerent Peter out of the bar and back to their house. And in the confusion, Peter knocked Isla to the ground.
Jesse just snapped. Jesse grabbed him and they started fist fighting. I was extremely freaked out by that point. That's when I grabbed Thane and took him out of there.
Isla then told Holland that she took her son to the park, where they stayed until the following morning.
When she came back, there was a mop in a bucket with some brown-looking water, that Jesse was covered in mud, that she never saw Peter again.
Isla said she suspected that Jesse killed Peter, but she was too afraid to go to the police, too afraid of Jesse.
I felt I could not trust him for fear he was going to hurt me or my child. I had a very real reason for that fear from what I had seen him do.
She puts all the blame on Jesse and indicates that she probably has a pretty good idea of what happened.
According to Louisiana Criminal Code, Isla's knowledge of the crime made her a principal to it. She was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. But the detectives had only half of the story. They needed to find Jesse. Holland issued a warrant for Jesse. New Orleans police rushed to his last known address, only to discover that they had missed him by 1 day. Jesse Lee was gone. 18 hours later, Isla decided she had more to say.
The following morning, I kept buzzing them and bugging them until I could get to talk to somebody.
She said that she wanted to give another statement because she had lied to me yesterday.
Isla's story was shocking, and now the hunt for Jesse would intensify. Even though Isla Womack claimed she didn't see her boyfriend Jesse Lee kill Peter Weber, she blamed him for the murder. 1 day later, she changed her story. This time, she says she saw the whole thing.
Jesse hit Peter in the head with a stool. At the same time that Peter was kicking at him. Peter had a big cut across the side of his head. I stepped into his living room just in time to see Peter slide down the wall. And then him and Jesse were rolling around on the floor.
She said that Jesse was yelling at Pete, spit in his face, grabbed Pete by the collar of his shirt and started banging his head against the floor. Then he pulled Pete's shirt down around his shoulders and wrapped his own white shirt around Pete's neck and started choking him. He was wringing it to get it tighter and tighter.
And I'm screaming at the two of them to stop. I grabbed Thane and put him in the bathtub. I remember standing there and thinking to myself, this is not happening. I know this is not happening. And the next thing that I can remember was Jesse saying, come on, Peter, man, it's not funny, wake up. There was going to be no waking up. Peter was dead. And he said, oh, God, man. He says, Isla, help me. You can't leave it like this, help me. I had folded the sheet over the top, and I wrapped it with the cord that used to be our clothesline outside around the bottom and around the top of it. That I had the idea for putting Peter underneath the house. Our intention was to eventually move Peter to put him into one of the older cemeteries so that he would be buried on hallowed ground.
But Detective Holland didn't buy it.
I think she still attempts to leave her own involvement to a minimum.
Isla and Jesse lived with Peter's body buried under the house for nearly 4 months.
Jesse was having horrible nightmares. He would wake up in the middle of the night screaming. He would tell me that he was dreaming that Peter had turned into a werewolf and was coming out from underneath the house after him. It became where neither one of us felt we could trust the other. I was afraid of him.
Months after Peter's murder, Isla and Jesse received an eviction notice for non-payment of rent. They panicked.
They were getting evicted. The body would be discovered, and it would immediately point back to them.
We moved Peter's body, intending to take it to a cemetery in St. Bernard. So we were driving around with a body in the back of the truck.
They drove around for hours in the middle of the night until they came to a small section of woods in rural St. Bernard Parish.
We pulled down to the little dirt road, through the little wooded area, pulled off to the side. I said, okay, this is the road, this is where we're gonna drop him at. We picked up Peter and we put him down in the trees, down in the ravine, and left it that way. We never did find that cemetery.
Isla confirmed what detectives had suspected all along. Peter Weber's body may have been dumped in St. Bernard Parish, but he had been murdered on North Lopez Street. It was there that detectives Holland and Anderson would look for evidence.
We went and found the shallow grave under the house, the clothesline, the other trace evidence.
Plastic garbage bags, some carpet fibers, which were green, the same color as the carpet that had been used to cover Peter Weber.
There were some blood samples taken from inside of the house. There were also some dirt specimens were compared to the samples of dirt that were taken from the bottom of the victim's shoes.
But the detectives found something else, something they had seen before. Dimes.
When Peter Weber was found, in his pants pocket were dimes. And there were also dimes in the shallow grave under the house.
I found that it was possible that the dimes were used as symbolic for silver, and silver would be used to ward off evil.
And the newspapers reported strange behavior at 1636 North Lopez that night.
The neighbors in the wee hours of the morning saw Jesse and Isla sitting face to face in the backyard with a white candle between the two of them. They could be praying for his soul to move on. They could be praying for him to be at peace. They could be praying that they don't get caught.
The detectives had to ask themselves if there was something more sinister to this crime than they had suspected.
My gut was there was possibly a ritualistic type aspect to this homicide. But you can't take gut feelings to criminal court.
30 hours after issuing a warrant for Jesse Lee, the detectives get a tip. An acquaintance says Jesse was staying at a house in Fort Walton Beach, Florida. Detective Holland immediately sent out a teletype to the local police. 2.5 hours later, the authorities surrounded the house. Jesse Lee surrendered quietly and was brought in for questioning.
I'm going to read you your Miranda warning. I want you to listen very carefully to this. You have the right to remain silent. Do you understand that?
Yes.
Having these rights in mind, do you wish to talk to me now?
I think the best thing I could do would be to have the lawyer here and talk to the lawyer and figure out what the hell's going on before anything happens. I will get back to New Orleans and take care of this.
In just a few short hours, detectives in New Orleans would hear what Jesse Lee had to say. Detectives Gina Holland and Kevin Anderson's work had paid off. Jesse Lee and Isla Womack were both facing criminal charges for the murder of their roommate, Peter Weber.
The next thing I knew, I was being indicted for second-degree murder. They sent my bond at $1.5 million.
Jesse Lee was on his way back to Louisiana in the custody of 2 officers from the St. Bernard Sheriff's Department.
While Jesse Lee was being transported from Fort Walton Beach to St. Bernard Parish, he told Sheriff Stevens and Captain David that he wanted to get something off his chest.
His story was that Peter Weber came in one night, he was intoxicated, he saw Peter Weber strike Miss Womack Gray.
He claimed that Peter was the aggressor and that he acted in self-defense.
Jesse Lee struck Mr. Weber, blacked out, woke up the next morning, found blood all over the place, the house was disheveled, and the victim, Peter Weber, was dead. That was his story.
Mr. Lee, you got any comments? Yeah. Anything to say?
When they brought him to me, he had a little pointy goatee and dark hair pulled back, and he looked like a witch. He looked like maybe the Halloween devil, but not red. He said that he would not give a formal statement, but that he would tell me that he was definitely involved in the murder of Peter Weber.
Jesse was locked up in the St. Bernard Parish prison. There, both he and Isla would await trial for murder.
I didn't care anymore. They were telling me they were going to take my son from me, that I was never going to see or hear from him again.
When Isla was taken into custody, a psychologist from Child Protective Services interviewed Thane about the night of the murder. Thane said he hadn't seen anything. He was sent to live with friends until the authorities could get in touch with his father, who lived out of state.
I vaguely remember the phone call by Child Protective Services saying, "Have you heard about your wife? She had been involved with a murder, that she was in custody, and that my son was staying with some people she had been staying with at the time, and that they needed to get someone to, take custody of him."
Once Thane was with his father, Detective Holland followed up herself to be sure that Thane had not witnessed anything.
I said, "I've asked him a couple of times if he remembered anything about it, if he was there or anything like that, and he had denied it." He said no.
It appeared that the 6-year-old couldn't offer any details about the night of the murder. The witch murder was front-page news. This case was strange, even by New Orleans standards.
The media was really harping on the witchcraft aspect of this case.
At the time, they called it the witch trial. This was the way that media got the attention of the readers.
Superstition and fear hovered over the case, and prosecutor Kevin Gilley was seeing it firsthand.
Religion is one of the things that is very entrenched in the city of New Orleans, and people are very much aware that voodoo and some of the occult things are also a part of that city. There was some talk in the DA's office that persons did not want to necessarily take this case because it did involve witchcraft.
Jesse Lee's trial was first. The state began by presenting the powerful evidence they had gathered against Lee.
There were knives found under the house that were used possibly to cut, lacerate, or maybe even stab Peter Weber. Testimony in the autopsy showed the way Jesse alleged to have committed this crime.
Jesse Lee overpowered the victim, forced him to the ground, beat him, and then strangled him.
There was the physical evidence with the carpet in terms of how he had wrapped Peter Weber in a sheet.
He was buried under the house where Mr. Weber, Mr. Lee, and Miss Womack Gray resided.
There were soil samples that were taken from the shoes of Peter Weber that matched the soil under the house.
There was evidence to show that it was moved from under that house out to an abandoned lot in St. Bernard Parish.
But Jesse Lee's own words to police proved to be the most damaging.
Jesse Lee made a statement to the police officers during his transporting back from Fort Walton that he in fact did commit this crime.
But in the courtroom, there was a noticeable absence. Neither the defense nor the prosecution made any mention of witchcraft. Judge Cannizzaro wanted to make sure that Jesse was prosecuted for his crime, not persecuted for his religion. But that didn't stop the occult from becoming a presence outside the courtroom.
There was a lot of support from the witch community. They kept showing up dressing like witches, and they were bringing attention to themselves.
Not too far from us, there was a female who was performing some type of ritual, and we found out later that she was attempting to put a hex on the jury or to try and get the jury to come back not guilty.
The jury returned in record time, just 15 minutes. Jesse Lee was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Isla's trial was just weeks away, and the prosecution was nervous about getting a conviction. They feared the jury would see her as a victim, frightened of Jesse's wrath.
I agreed to represent Isla Womack on a pro bono basis. My theory of the case was that the state didn't have enough evidence.
All prosecutors had was Isla's admission that she helped move Peter's body.
The statements alone would not have been enough to prove that Isla had committed this crime.
Our concern with Isla's trial was that Isla could possibly get away with murder.
Then, Detective Holland got a break she never expected.
I get a frantic phone call from Patrick Womack, who's very excited and tells me that something triggered Thane today.
It was extremely surreal to be standing there listening to this 7-year-old boy tell you a scene that you're accustomed to seeing in movies.
Now, Lord, don't turn your child away. Say, please, I'm begging you, Lord, please don't drive me.
Prosecutors feared that with Jesse Lee already paying for Peter Weber's murder, Isla Womack might walk.
Lord, I'm sorry to my heart.
Then, just before the trial, an unexpected witness emerged.
This had been a little while, and I went to ask him. I just asked him, hey, Thane, do you remember anything about the night that Peter Weber died? And he looked at me and said, yeah, he broke my chair.
Isla's young son suddenly remembered something.
What triggered this episode with Thane was a stool Thane had been using as an altar. It was a little step stool with a dragon painted on it.
I found it broken after the murder.
He talked about the blood on the floor. And finally, my current wife, who is an artist, picked up a pencil and said, okay, draw it for me.
His father watched intently as Thane drew a layout of the house. He made a mark showing exactly where the fight between Jesse and Peter took place.
I received the drawing in the mail from Patrick Womack. I believe this child, Thane, was a witness to this entire incident.
The detectives brought Thane back to New Orleans so that he could tell them what he remembered about that night.
We were in a meeting room at the New Orleans District Attorney's office. Thane was telling us that he saw Jesse hit his babysitter with his stool.
He saw his mother ran past him and grabbed the knife. He heard Peter Weber say, no, Isla, no, don't.
No, Isla, no.
No, Isla.
No. No, Isla, no, Isla, don't.
And I hear this, no, Isla, and silence.
And he never saw his babysitter again.
Prosecutor Kevin Gilley knew that Thane's testimony would devastate the defense and arranged for Thane, even though he was only 7, to be called as a witness.
When I heard I had to go to court to talk about what happened with my mom, I was kind of scared at first.
In March of 1998, Isla Womack's trial began. The state presented the same physical evidence that they did at Jesse Lee's trial: the sheet, the clothesline, the dirt, and the carpet. But while Jesse had confessed to the murder in his statement, Isla had only admitted to helping dispose of the body. Thane would paint a very different picture.
Thane was led into the courtroom, and it's usually done in a very dramatic fashion.
I met him about halfway coming into the courtroom and helped him get to the witness stand.
Seeing my son come into the courtroom was very painful because he wouldn't even look at me.
It made me really worried about seeing her in court. I was afraid she'd have to go away, and I didn't want her going away.
This child looked like Opie Taylor from the Andy Griffith Show. He had a little crew cut, and he had the smallest voice I've ever heard.
The jury was riveted as they listened to Thane describe the last moments of Peter Weber's life.
I saw this in the corner, fight.
My mom told me to go into my room.
Then I saw my mom come out and grab the knife.
And I hear this, "No, Isla."
Then after that, it was nice and peace and quiet.
He got up there and lied.
Thane's testimony was a huge blow to the defense.
He was just a very powerful witness against his mother.
But the prosecution still lacked one important piece of the puzzle: motive.
More often than not, in a case, you can have some motive that you could understand. In this case, we could never really figure out what the motive was.
Isla's trial had lasted only 3 days. The jury returned in 2 hours. Isla Womack was found guilty of the murder of Peter Weber.
My heart sunk down to my toes. I was never going to be free again, no matter what.
Isla Womack and Jesse Lee are each serving life sentences in Louisiana state penitentiaries. While the question of their guilt was decided, another remained unanswered. Was Peter Weber's murder born of rage or ritual?
I do not believe that the act of murdering this boy had anything to do with her spiritual path. But I don't doubt that she would have stepped into a state where the disposal of the body was a ritual.
Can I say that this case was directly related to witchcraft? No, I really can't. But I can't rule it out in my own mind either. There's something missing from this puzzle, and I may never know what it is. Only Isla knows. Only Jesse knows.
While Thane Womack has adjusted to his new life with his father, the scars from North Lopez Street may never heal.
It affected him very much. He went through a tremendous amount at 6 than most people go through in their entire lifetime.
I miss her, yes, I do. I miss her. Sometimes I'm angry about what she did because I think that if she hadn't killed him, she'd still be with me.
Peter Weber's family continues to grieve for their brother, but they will never forget the 2 detectives who put an end to their anguish and brought Peter's killers to justice.
Our family feels that without Kevin Anderson and Gina Holland, we would never have been able to find Peter. Kevin and Gina will be a part of our family forever.